If you follow the watch market just a little bit, you'll know that Rolex makes up 30% of all volume sales in Swiss watches. A Daytona is still one of the most desirable watches on the planet. Rolex bought Bucherer, and Rolex also bought the building in Geneva where Omega has their flagship store. Rolex is starting to get a little bit scary, so I thought it was time to add my 2 cents on what is going on with Rolex and what it means for the rest of us. Let's dive in. Rolex have a ridiculous amount of money. They are very good at what they do, but not unsurprisingly, they do have some challenges, which I'm sure they are well aware of and busy fixing. These are my thoughts on what their challenges are and what I think they might be doing to fix them. The state of the watch market in general is as follows. We are currently in a down cycle. We came out of the pandemic with a hyperinflated watch market where everything was unavailable. Demand was sky high, and there literally was not any watch in a Rolex boutique that you could walk out of the store with unless you had a significant purchase history with that AD. This has changed, and as I ever so humbly predicted a couple of months back, everything is contracting in terms of demand, and Rolex models are becoming available. Odds are it will eventually at some point be able to get very close to or possibly even below retail. Even brand new models like the Guinness Grey GMT in both two-tone and full gold are available, and with a little bit of effort you can get them close to or even below retail. Some models still command a premium, most notably a lot of the steel divers, the GMTs, and of course the Daytona. But people are not falling over themselves to get anything Rolex anymore. I also think it's going to go down even more before it inevitably starts going up again. At the same time, Rolex has their pre-owned certified collection with Bucherer, and my own totally unscientific analysis, which involves me going down to my local Bucherer store, tells me that most of the watches are not moving from those display cases. There are multiple Daytonas that have been sitting there for weeks. Gold Yachtmasters and diamond set Datejusts are not moving at anything resembling a breakneck pace. Then Rolex bought Bucherer, one of the oldest and largest chains of luxury watch retailers in the world. Plus, what might be called the troll move, they have actually bought the building that houses the Geneva Omega flagship store. Last but not least, Rolex is in the process of expanding production and building a new giant factory that should be ready towards the end of the decade. Actual numbers are not super clear, but estimates say that Rolex should be able to expand production up to nearing 2 million watches, up from about 1.2 million right now. Increasing the capacity of their production is absolutely tantamount to Rolex's future success. Rolex may be dominant, but in at least the 20 years where I've been in the watch community, I have never experienced a period where so many people have had such a negative impression of Rolex, and a large part of this was because of supply, or rather lack thereof. Rolex may be luxury and status to many, but this is after all a brand that sells over 1 million watches, compared to Patek and AP that make between 40 and 60,000 each. Rolex is a behemoth, and Rolex is and cannot be as exclusive as Patek or AP. 1 million watches means you are fairly mainstream, and people do expect to be able to buy a Rolex with some level of ease. People are not going to go through the same buying process the AP buyers are to get an AP Spider-Man for a Oyster Perpetual. So some people may believe that Rolex has enjoyed this level of desirability where every watch commanded a waiting list, but I honestly don't believe that this is what Rolex want or that it is in their interests. Some Rolex models have to be available in the store. The Oyster Perpetual, the Datejusts, the Submariner. These 3 models plus a handful of others have to be readily available. They need to be readily available in both the base steel models and in most two-tone configurations. A month wait is something you can probably live with, but generally they need to be close to walk-in and buy models. These models are good and popular for a reason, but too many people walk into the store, see those watches unavailable, and buy a Seamaster or a Tudor instead. Most people, and I stress, most customers are not going to buy multiple watches at one AD. Rolex needs these single buyers to perpetuate the brand and its status. And fine, the GMT and the Daytona, maybe you have to work a bit for those. But even Patek has models that you can walk in and buy off the shelf, and they are objectively far more exclusive than Rolex. The new factory will to some degree alleviate this problem, but not completely. The world is continuing to become more wealthy, and in general, the global economy will continue to grow. We may be in a slump kind of situation right now, but things will pick up again, as they always tend to do. Assuming, just 5% in increase, the number of people that become upper middle class every year, by the time we get to 2029, Rolex will need 1.7 million watches to keep up with that base level of demand. I've read estimates that by 2029, the base demand will be even higher, but I just kind of settled on 5% as an aggressive number, but not wholly unrealistic. Realistically, it means we'll see an improvement in supply, but in general, I don't necessarily expect them to get to a level where everything will be available everywhere at any time, even if they wanted to. Which they don't, but my point is they probably couldn't if they tried. Things will get better, but the Daytona I expect will never be a walk-in model, not in plain steel at least, ever again. Related to supply, but not solely, is the buying experience. This is by a country mile Rolex's biggest problem. I would venture that a vast majority of comments in the comments below will be around how people have had experiences with bad ADs. ADs seemingly too arrogant to talk to clients that are only interested in Rolex. ADs that force you to jump through commercial hoops to gain access to that Rolex that you've been dreaming of. I personally have never had that experience myself. I'm lucky to have ADs that are not only nice to me, but as far as I can tell, they are nice to most people that walk through the door. But I accept that it is likely that AD experiences for many when it comes to Rolex have been positively disastrous. Rolex doesn't want this. Of course they don't. Being as dominant as they are can make a brand complacent and arrogant even. But at the core, I think they understand that there is a fine line between highly desirable and being aloof and arrogant. Rolex have, through their ADs, been the latter for some time. So what are they doing? Well, they bought Bucherer and the Omega building. Some would have you believe that they are going to go to a boutique-only model. It's one of those theories that gets thrown around out there every now and again. I definitely don't agree though, and it's because I can't get the numbers to work. For context, Audemars Piguet sells 50,000 watches a year. They have approximately 120 locations where their watches are sold, of which around 50 are dedicated AP-only boutiques. AP has also stated that in their own network, they have 10 stores that sell over 1,000 watches a year. That's 3 a day, all year round, give or take. We also know that AP does about 75% of their sales through their own boutiques. What does this mean? Well, on average, AP is selling 750 watches per store in their own boutiques and 180 watches or so watches per store in their external dealers. That's an average of 416 per store. Patek sells 68,000 watches according to the Morgan Stanley report. Compared to AP, they have 45 stores in the US that sell their watches compared to AP's 29. Globally, Patek lists 341 outlets. The volume per store of Patek is going to be lower. Much lower. It's averaging about 200 watches per store. Rolex currently has over 2,000 retailers globally. At 1.2 million watches a year, that means an average of about 600 watches per store. So 2 Rolexes a day on average. AP is averaging 400 watches per store or 1,000 in 10 of them. Patek, 200. Rolex is averaging right now 600 per store with over 2,000 stores. As an added data point, I ran these numbers against the Morgan Stanley watch report, and on average, that means each store is netting Rolex about 4 million Swiss francs. Patek is making about 4.5 million per store. AP, they're making 13.5 million per store. That's wild. Wild. That was a lot of numbers, but these lead to some questions that I have for you. Knowing that AP currently only has 10 stores that sell more than 1,000 watches a year, how many stores globally do you think can sell 2,000 Rolexes a year or 3,000 Rolexes a year? 3,000 a year is 8 to 10 watches per day. How many stores do you think can scale in the location they are right now from an average of 600 watches to 3,000 watches a year? How intimate do you think a store that sells 3,000 Rolexes a year is going to feel? How expensive do you think it is to run a store that has the size where they can stock 3,000 Rolexes a year? I'm totally confident that Rolex wants to reduce the size of their dealer network, but because of their sheer size, and here you have to remember that they're going to be able to produce 2 million watches. At 2,000 stores, that's 1,000 watches per store, more than 5 times the volume of Patek stores. Let's just assume that Rolex can reduce the overall number of stores to, I don't know, 1,000. So half of what they have now. At 2 million watches, that means each store will be selling 3.5 times more watches on average than the current network, and 10 times more watches than Patek. Those are huge volumes that we are assuming there are enough locations that can handle that kind of volume. I mean, there are, after all, only 500 cities in the world with over 1 million inhabitants. Obviously, the size of a city is not the only factor that says something about purchasing power, but it does play a part. But let's assume, again, that they can get their dealer network down to 1,000 stores. That's a 50% drop from current levels and a 3.5 times increase in volume per store. What do you do with those remaining 1,000 ADs? Well, Rolex currently has 100 stores with Bucherer. They are still 900 stores short from going full boutique. Rolex has more money than you can imagine. Their new factory could quite possibly function as like, a Scrooge McDuck money vault. But finding 900 more stores when you've already bought more or less the largest retailer is going to be exceedingly difficult. Watches of Switzerland is likely the second biggest AD conglomerate, and they are not up for sale as far as I know, and they make up less than 100 stores. Large Asian chains are, to my knowledge, not up for sale and nowhere near that size. The point of all this is that Rolex would have to buy tons of single location setups. These locations are going to be in prime locations, and whenever they show up, the locals are going to demand a massive premium because they know Rolex wants the location. Rolex, again, is not short on cash, but this is going to be ridiculously expensive and time-consuming. Bucherer got them 100 stores overnight, but they were the biggest dealer. Each deal from now on is going to get progressively smaller and harder. And here's the next complication. Bucherer is the one that's good at running boutiques. That's part of why Rolex bought them, because Rolex are not experts at running stores. Rolex are experts at making watches, and by buying Bucherer, they gain insight into how to open and run stores, which is a very different business. But Bucherer can't just organically scale from 100 to 1,000 stores in 5 years. Nobody can scale a business that fast. The numbers just don't add up. Boutique only is just not feasible. Anybody saying, well, you're making the assumption on 1,000 stores globally. What if it was only 500 stores? Well, that's a reasonable question, but I think we have to go back to the questions I asked earlier. At 500 stores, that's 4,000 Rolexes per store. Considering that AP has 50 stores for 50,000 watches, that just seems off. 4,000. That's not a boutique. That's a supermarket. Again, boutique only is not realistic. A 66% reduction in number of outlets to get to 500, I also don't see as realistic, at least not in the next 5 years. But what is? The answer is linked to supply. 1. If I were the Rolex CEO, I would, of course, open more flagship stores. Bucherer will likely get the job, or Bucherer execs will be moved around to become head of the Rolex retail division. They will be tasked with finding locations and opening locations. These flagship stores are going to be different in one very key way. They will have all the cool stuff. These would be my tier 1 stores. 2. I would enter into more partnerships with key large-scale distributors like Watches of Switzerland and others, which they already do have as partners, to be transparent. But these dealers will be held to a very high standard, subject to even more stringent checks and controls on customer service. They would get a decent cut of the pie, and they will get some of the cool stuff. Not a lot, but some. These become your tier 2 stores. 3. We reduce the overall number of affiliate independent AD retailers. We reduce them based on volumes they deliver and by doing objective secret shopper tests to gauge their capacity to live up to the clearly defined Rolex client experience standards, and reduce them by proximity to prime Rolex flagship stores. It's not going to be the backwater Rolex store that needs to be worried, but rather the long-time Rolex dealer in Manhattan that gets a flagship store as its next door neighbor. These become tier 3 stores. Do they get a lot of the cool stuff? No, not in general. They get the bread and butter watches for the most part. I don't know the numbers, and I'm not going to hazard a guess, but the direction, having Bucherer and flagship stores that drive the high-end, in-demand, most desirable sales, and then a broader network that gets the bread and butter OPs, Datejust, Explorers, and Submariners, I can see that happening. Then there's Omega and Longines and JLC and all the others that sell their stuff through Bucherer. I know that there's a lot of talk about how Rolex now makes money off of sales of other brands' watches. Was this Rolex's intention? No, I think it's a side effect of them buying Bucherer, not a goal in itself. What's going to happen there? Well, I think a couple of things. I think as part of this purchase, Rolex are likely making some promises to Omega and the others and antitrust authorities that this will not lead to shady practices. If it does lead to shady practices, some of the brands, notably the big ones, will likely have to make a strategic decision about pulling out of the Bucherer stores. The thing you have to remember, though, is that already before the Bucherer deal, all ADs that had Rolex have always been tilted towards Rolex. Rolex always has the most prominent location and space in the AD stores. They are almost always the largest space, and Rolex largely dictates what is left for the other brands to fight about. In that way, this is just a distilled version of this, but it doesn't change the fact that a brand like JLC or Omega will think long and hard about the Bucherer relationship, and if they see their numbers tanking in those stores, then they'll have to make a business decision. From Rolex's perspective, I actually don't think they really consider their competition that much. Rolex are so large and so dominant that they do their own thing, and that's not going to change going forward. Which brings me to the last piece of the equation, control. Rolex does not like flippers. They like them as little as they like ADs that give them a bad name. But imagine the scenario I've described. 2 million watches. A smaller retail network with an expanded network of Bucherer and Rolex flagships that have primary control over the good stuff. The bad ADs, they control them through quality tests and weed them out of the network. The good ADs, they get controlled by steering supply to the better stores and at the center where the locus of control is greatest, where they have their own stores, flagships or Bucherer. That's control with and of supply. In addition to that, already now, you can't go into a Rolex store anymore, buy a Datejust, and immediately ask to have a new dial insert put in. This used to be common practice. Now you have to wait, I think it's 2 years before you can change the dial. Certified pre-owned, it's in a different color box, so the watch cannot be resold as new. It's a visibly used watch. Rolex controls this and other things. Once you put your name down in that Bucherer store, in the Rolex boutique, they have you linked to that watch in a way that they never had before. Before, the knowledge was with the AD, and that didn't change hands, at least not in the EU, where data protection is a thing. Rolex can affect that with their flagship stores. If your watch with your serial number shows up somewhere else, you're potentially blacklisted. Okay, the last bit is a little bit more of an exaggeration and overly conspiratorial even, especially for me. I think it's hard to blacklist for a number of reasons, but grey market dealers will have to get more sophisticated about how they can get a hold of the watches. And over time, data on buyers' purchase patterns will become more readily accessible to Rolex. Setting aside the conspiracy theory piece, I do think that Rolex has some ideas about how to better use customer data to exercise greater control over what happens to those in-demand watches. Rolex is going to become more available. Rolex won't be boutique only, but the good stuff is going to make its way to the stores that Rolex exert their greatest control over, using supply to guide and control AD behavior within the network, and also to a larger extent benefiting the stores where they have the greatest control, because they will be their own. In some ways, this is not a lot different from what's already been happening for many, many years at Rolex. It's just going to become more distilled, more clear, and more in Rolex's favor. Is this a good thing or a bad thing for consumers? Well, it depends. I think in general, flippers and grey dealers are going to have a tougher time getting watches from a smaller network where the watches they really want their hands on are under tighter control. That's also good for consumers. I actually think it's fine there's a grey market. Having a mechanism that regulates market pricing is overall good. Yeah, it sucks when it means a Rolex costs twice as much as Rolex thinks it should, but it's fine when I can get a reverso at half MSRP. Having said that, a Rolex experience that forces ADs to behave even better is good. Arrogant AD? Why would Rolex want that AD in the network? Why would they want their own stores to be arrogant? This has potential to give the customer a better experience. But if you want the good stuff, you're likely going to have to go to that Bucherer or flagship store. Otherwise, you're going to be fresh out of luck. And because those flagship stores are only going to have Rolex, you have to build a relationship purely based on Rolex and maybe Tudor purchases. Your Omega purchases, your JLC purchase, your Longines purchase, your Cartier purchase won't count. They will at Bucherer, but not in the flagships, and that's going to feel extortionate to some. And how much of your data do you want to hand over to Rolex? Do you want to sit for an interview like they do at Patek or AP? I'm not sure I would appreciate that piece if it turns out to be the case. What will ultimately happen? Only time will tell. But this is my current perspective. Rolex will be fine for better or worse for us enthusiasts. Let me know what you think is going to happen in the comments. Come on, speculate with me. Like, subscribe. Cheers.